Happy Monday, everybody. All right, we're watching history happen right now. And I'm going to piggyback on Greg's video this morning. So what we're watching right now is a historic shift with central banks. I'm about to show you a chart to demonstrate this, but before I do, I'm going to explain what's been happening. We've been talking about the price of gold rising and what's been causing that. Well, it hasn't been investor demand like us, like you watching and us here at Zanetti Financial. The demand has been driven by central banks who are buying more and more and pushing that price up. So I decided to go back and look through history because something interesting just happened, and gold became the number one asset held within central banks. We talked about it this last summer, how gold became second place ahead of the euro. Gold left the euro behind, becoming second place among central banks. But the US Treasuries were still in first place among holdings. Well, we just broke that level too. So central banks, their number one holding around the globe now is gold, with US Treasuries being second place. So then I decided to look back through history and how that trend is performed. And so I'm going to show you a chart here that I built, but here it is. And what you've got here is for the last 50 years, starting in 1975 up till today, and you've got two measurements. You've got gold in orange and US Treasuries in blue. And you can see from the 1970s until a peak in 2005, US Treasuries were growing and growing and growing in terms of their percentage of holdings. And here in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s sometime, US Treasuries actually surpassed gold. Now let's talk about that for a minute. Why were US Treasuries growing while gold was falling? Well, gold was kind of after the Bretton Woods agreement around the world. Gold was considered a barbarous relic. Meanwhile, the United States, our currency was a fiat, but it was still backed by oil. It was also backed by the largest military, the greatest military the world has ever seen, with the largest U.S. arsenal, largest nuclear arsenal. And then you'll see here in this chart, here in 1995, US Treasuries take an uptick. Well, what happened here in the late 90s? The Soviet Union fell. So then it became the US government as the big gorilla on the street. So the US government was creating general peace and prosperity around the globe. We were the strongest military and we had influence. But we kept going into greater and greater debt. And then what you see here in 2005, and these blocks, this was a simple chart I built, but they're in decade blocks. So we're not seeing the nuance in between in the individual years. But here in 2005, it peaks, and from there, it starts to decline. Well, what happened around here was the Great Recession, right? And that's when the United States started going into massive debt. And it keeps going. Well, now here we are. And in 2005, that's when gold bottomed out and started growing. And look at here, between 2015 and 2025, it takes a steep upcline. And we've now replaced the US Treasuries for the first time since US Treasuries took the lead. It's the first time, so 30 years. And that's where you're watching history happen. There is a historic shift in monetary policy right now. It's how we talk about how voters vote with their feet, right? Well, this is central banks voting on their own stability. And they're saying, you know what? We've got US Treasuries in our holdings as our reserve, as our safety net. I don't know if we can count on the US government. Why? Well, first of all, they're spending like crazy. Their debt is growing and growing and growing, and there's a chance there might be a default. But here's the other big problem. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the US froze Russian US assets, their US Treasuries, through the SWIFT system. And that's kind of like a default to central banks around the world, because all these central banks started saying, wait a minute, if they can do that to Russia, that means they could do it to us. And China, for instance, they're a huge lender to us. US Treasuries are our form of debt. And so when other countries buy our debt, that's them lending to us. Well, China's been lending to us like crazy, but they must be thinking, wait a minute, if we do something that the United States doesn't like, and they're always telling us we are, then they could freeze our loans that we've given them and not pay us back. All right, we're going to start shifting that our policy and putting more gold in there. So, all right, so what does this mean? So I'm going to wrap that up. History is happening, and it's kind of exciting from a history bugs perspective. But what does this mean for us as investors? Well, the good news is that the price demands that have been pushing the price of gold up hasn't been driven by investor sentiment. When it's being driven by investor sentiment, that's when you need to be on the lookout looking for an exit plan. And Greg and I plan on doing that at some point, but we're not there yet. What has driven the price of gold up has been central banks, and central banks are not investors. They're banks. They're looking for security and reserves. They're not looking for an exit point. So the prices that have been going up, yes, we'll see some variation, but it should be a pretty stable price point. Central banks are only going to be selling their gold if they need the liquidity, if they need for their own country's uses or for a war or something like that. But outside of that, they're going to be holding their reserves, which will keep a pretty good price stability on the price of gold. And so for investors, that's a good sign. All right. With that, you all have a great week. Take care.